Hello and hi.
Hi.
Welcome to the Priced Out podcast live stream, unexpectedly showing up in Facebook at random times. And here in the podcast universe as well on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. I'm here with Margot Black, who is a housing advocate here in the city of Portland. And she is going to talk to us about the rent control proposal facing the Oregon Legislature here in the early days of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
This is a pretty revolutionary idea of statewide rent control.
Mm-hmm.
And Margot was recently written up in the Wall Street Journal as almost being single-handedly responsible for creating rent control in the state of Oregon.
I was not at all responsible for this particular bill, but they have credited me with it, which is flattering.
It's flattering. It's sort of we were saying that it's sort of a compliment to be called names by the Wall Street Journal, and they were only blaming you so they could blame somebody.
Yeah, exactly.
But you have been a big player in the activist
I've been
world.
a big proponent of rent control. I mean, I'll certainly take some credit for upping the volume to make rent control be taken more seriously as a policy solution. I only mean the particular bill that is facing the legislature is revolutionary in some ways, but is not the bill I would have written. So that's all I mean by not wanting credit for this particular bill, but I'll take credit for rent control.
Now you are one of the founding members of Portland Tenants United.
Portland Tenants United.
Mm-hmm. And you're featured in some of the verite street protest shots in Priced Out.
Mm-hmm. And
can you tell us a little bit more just about yourself and how you got involved with housing advocacy?
So I am a renter myself and probably will be forever. And I got involved. I've had my own really hard housing traumas as a renter, in particular as a single mom, a single teen mom more than 20 years ago when I was no cause evicted from a small apartment complex, and then have had some ups and downs, mostly some like really deep downs in the Oregon and the Portland rental market since then. And, at a certain point, I really just, things just, when you sort of follow the rules, you pay your rent on time, you don't kick your neighbors in the shins, you are a good neighbor, good tenant, take care of your home, and then you still either get kicked out of it, get a huge rent increase you can't afford, or just feel kind of intimidated or scared of asking your landlord for things, or just kind of feeling like you have no power and security. You start to ask, like, why is that? And especially like as rents climbed
in 2015.
Yeah, they climbed well above what we kind of had internalized as what people pay for a mortgage. I remember the first time I was paying more than $1,500 in rent, and I would, first of all, that was just way more than I thought I would pay, especially like in an apartment complex that is not fancy at all. But you talk to people about that and they'd be like, oh my gosh, that's more than a mortgage. Now, of course, mortgages are now more expensive as well, but so
when did you decide to sort of take to the streets?
Well, because you start to feel that powerlessness, and you wonder, like, why does it make sense? And you kind of realize, oh, this is all by design, and nobody's doing anything about it. I had another no cause eviction like 8 years ago. I wrote the city commissioners, the governor, the legislators, and they were all kind of like, bummer, not my problem,
Right.
And I could tell like nobody was like working on this. Nobody knew whose job it was. I was also in a lot of Facebook groups for moms because my kids were littler, and I was seeing a lot of moms, especially single moms, come out, and they were losing their housing. They couldn't find housing. Their rent was going up. They were getting intimidated or harassed by their landlord, and they just had no idea what their rights were, and they were scared. They were sleeping in their cars, and it was just like nobody's doing anything about this, and so I started with a Facebook group for renters, and then more and more people were like, well, what are we going to do about it? And we just came together. And
what year was that?
It was 2015, and the summer of 2015. And, we felt like what was needed was definitely direct action around the issue. Like, whatever was happening, you know, in boardrooms behind closed doors. And it was just really important that we started to, like, you know, demand more and better from everybody. And so that was when we literally took to the streets. And I mean, I would say we've kind of been blazing the trail as we walk it in terms of what we take to the streets for, what our demands are.
And I would describe you as kind of like a tip of the spear movement. All, you know, activist movements, or, you know, these political movements, I think, especially on the left, have these sort of groups that are tip of the spear. They're out in the streets. They're not the groups that are lobbying. They're not the groups that are necessarily making the deals when a reform actually does become law. They're the ones who are agitating, being the most visible, sometimes getting arrested. They're the ones who are in front of the cameras, and they're the ones who are making the loudest demands. Yeah, but I would say, you know, what I think is unique, I think, about at least Portland Tenants United, is that we've had a you know, an inside-outside game. So we've been in the street, and we've been, you know, fierce and unapologetic about that. But then we've also, you know, been in the halls of power and been able to make influence there. I mean, and that's because Chloe. Well, right. But, I mean, Chloe started a Facebook group about high housing the same time I started my renters' rights one, and we were sort of natural allies. And she was actually an early member of the board of PTU. It's not called the board; it's called the organizing committee. But, you know, she was not a groomed politician who'd had, you know, this dream of being a city council person. She basically became the person running on our issues. And then, of course, we all, you know, dove in, and, you know, she was maybe the first city council candidate ever to, like, canvass east of 82nd Avenue, like where renters and working class people live. And that's Chloe Udali, who is Portland City Commissioner, City Councilor now, the first renter to be elected to the City Council. And as I've said before, she, like, literally went from being holding a sign, picketing City Hall, to being inside, sitting at the City Councilor's desk within a period of a couple of months. And her policy director, and we'll talk Jamie more about her, was on our, you know, was a very committed member of PTU, and then moved right into, you know, Chloe's office. So we've had the outside game, and we're taken seriously on the inside too, because we, you know, we're on the right side of the message, and I think, you know, we're talking about, we're speaking truth to power. So here we are, almost 4 years later, and now there is a rent control proposal making its way through the Oregon Legislature. And that was a long road to hoe for activists, and we've talked about this a lot in previous podcasts, and we'll talk a little bit about the inside baseball. But can you tell us what is before, or what will be going before the legislature here? Yeah, so the bill, Senate Bill 608, does a couple things. The biggest thing it does is it limits rent increases in most cases to 7% plus inflation. So this year that would be 10.4% statewide. So if this bill passes, your landlord will not be able to raise your rent more than the plus inflation. Let's say that's 2 to 3 points, because it's based on the Western CPI, not the national CPI. So your landlord won't be able to raise your rent by more than 9 to 11% a year in the state of Oregon. And what makes that historic and a really big deal is that it's a statewide measure. Right. Rent control is not historic. It's in more than 200 cities across the United States, most of Canada, lots of parts of the world. And rent control also isn't a monolithic policy, but at least one simple component of it is usually limiting how much rent can go up each year. So in terms of rent control, I've never seen a rent control policy that lets rents go up by more than 5%. That's the highest. Mm-hmm. So my biggest problem with this bill is that for all the history it's making, it's not actually stabilizing rents. They call it rent stabilization, but a 10% yearly increase is not stable. Well, before we get into, but it does limit. It's anti-price gouging. I mean, it does. Right. It does say that 20%, 50%. You know, you can't come in and just, you know, raise the rent by however much you want. On the other hand, it does exempt
buildings that are less than 15 years old. And so that's, that's what I just want to make that clear. That's what when I said some buildings will be rent controlled and others won't. Do you want me to talk about the other part of the bill, or just?
Yeah, the other part of the bill is that there will be, you have to evict people for just cause. Yeah.
So for the first year of
just to set that up, first of all, the state of Oregon does not require a reason to evict someone if they're on a month-to-month lease, and then rent control in the state is currently forbidden. Right? There's a statewide ban on rent control.
On local rent control, right?
Yeah.
And there will still be a ban on local rent control.
Okay, so then that's what we're going to talk more about. But yeah, let's get into we'll go into the other part of the bill.
I mean, so the big picture is that we're trying to prevent or mitigate displacement, right? You move into your apartment, you pay your rent.
Tell us what's in the bill, and then we'll talk about kind of the aims.
So there's the rent stabilization, and then there's the just cause or eviction protection. So as you said, right now, a landlord can say, hey, you got to go. I'm not giving you any reason for that. It could be because I'm racist or sexist. It could be because I don't like the purple pants you wore. It could be because you, asked me to fix the sink and that I don't want. But
could be that you're dealing drugs or you're bothering neighbors. Could be you're cooking mess.
Although
many reasons.
But I would say I don't think that landlords usually use no cause evictions for doing drugs and bothering neighbors, maybe. But I mean, we have a for cause process that is actually much more efficient than the no cause process. Like if you really have somebody who's posing, risk or threat to neighbors or property or breaking the law, you don't need to give them, why would you give them 30, 60 or 90 days notice when you could, for cause evict them? So
you have to have proof though to for cause evict them.
Yeah, it's due process. Yes. Right. Well, not necessarily. And I mean, you don't even it doesn't even touch the courtroom or judge or anything until you won't have to have proof unless somebody's fighting it. So anyway, so for the first year that someone lives in their home, they can still be no caused. After the first year, a landlord will only be able to kick you out for a good reason. So one of those good reasons is, non-payment of rent or drugs or bothering the neighbors, but you have to do it through the for cause eviction process. And then the other good reasons landlord-based reasons are maybe the owner is moving in or moving an immediate family member in, selling, they need to do significant renovations, or they are converting it to an Airbnb or something like that. So, and then in some cases, if they kick you out for a landlord-based reason, they will give you 1 month rent to help you relocate. In Portland, the protections are stronger, but outside of Portland, it'll be 1 month rent for people who live in a basically their landlord owns more than 5 units. Okay,
and so that's the bill basically. Now, Portland, just to make things more complicated, Portland has a relocation fee policy, which says if you evict someone without cause or raise their rent more than 10%, then they can't pay. The landlord has to pay to relocate that person. Basically, has to pay a fee to that person based on the size of the apartment,
between $2,900 and $4,500.
So that we're doing a lot of microphone slapping here this morning. So that would stay in place. The relocation fee would stay in place, and under this bill, municipalities would not be able to pass their own rent control law. So they couldn't say, well, the local rent control says you can't raise the rent 5% or more. Well,
so local jurisdictions can still pass their own relocation ordinances, and that is what I think we need to send the message out about, is that this bill is going to put some protections in place for sure, but it is, to the extent that the bill is meant to actually prevent and mitigate displacement, there are a whole lot of loopholes and the disincentives aren't high enough and blah blah blah. And so I would say that local jurisdictions can and absolutely should still put in a policy similar to the relocation ordinance. And ours is at 10%, our cutoff is at 10%, but there isn't any reason why that couldn't be a little bit lower.
Right now, the relocation fee is actually, the proposed rent control is more stringent, it's stricter on price increase than Portland's relocation fee.
No, it allows a higher rent.
Because the relo is at 10% increase,
Uh-huh.
and rent control would be at 7% plus,
which
plus
is 10.4 this year.
But it could be below that, right?
It could be below that. Yeah, it could be below that. And if it's below that, then in Portland, nobody's going to get a rent increase that would trigger relocation.
Mm-hmm.
Although we're allowed, utilities and things like that, utilities, storage you might pay for, pet rent, parking if you have to pay for that, a lot of ancillary charges that landlords tack on that don't count as rent, and actually pet rent I think counts as rent. But in Portland, if those are increased to get around the 10% cap, then you can still get relo. The rent control bill will still allow those to increase without bound. And so it's so yes, I mean, in terms of how much the rent is allowed to go up, they're going to be kind of similar. I would say the goals of the relo and the rent stabilization in terms of where that cap was set are different. But yes, there will be times where it will be more stringent, or the cap will be lower than what triggers relo in Portland.
So before we go into what you think the policy should be, let's go into a little bit about how this policy came about. I guess my first question is, why have statewide rent control when the legislature can just repeal the ban on rent control? And then if some city wants to impose rent control, let them do it. And if other people say it's not a problem, why does Malheur County need a rent cap? Maybe there's no renters in Malheur.
And maybe Malheur County doesn't, but why do renters in Malheur County need, why shouldn't they be protected from 50% rent increases, right?
Right, but I guess my first question is, why not have a policy that allows for maximum flexibility?
I think that's a good question. I think that we should pass this bill and lift the ban on rent control so that we can do both, because I think it's really a problem to call this bill rent control or rent stabilization, because it just isn't doing that.
And that's because the cap
is so high. It's 3
yeah.
times higher than what we would see in a normal healthy housing market on the outside. A normal healthy housing market, we wouldn't see rent going up by more than 1 or 2%, per year, if even that, and certainly no more than 3%, because that's what banks want to see for financing, but
we have been seeing, so people who listen to this know, but people in Portland know, is that over the last 3 or 4 years, on average, there's been a double-digit rent increase in the Portland metro area. Some say as high as 30% rent increase since 2017, 2015.
Well, and one of the news articles that made headlines was an over 60% rent increase over 5 years. That came out in 2016, I think, but it was like a really big, everybody shared it, everybody was talking about it. But the thing is that this policy will allow rents to go up by more than 60% over 5 years.
Because they can go up 7% plus inflation every year.
Yeah,
right.
And so that's why we need to really be careful about the language we're using. It's not stabilizing rents. It is protecting people from the shock, from
eviction
huge,
by rent increase.
From economic eviction. Well, it's not preventing that either. I can't, if I get a 10% rent increase on my rent, I will be priced out of my home, and that's allowed.
And I know you're an advocate, and it's my job to push back a little bit.
Push back.
Which is, we are reporting, and we have been reporting for the last 4 years on people who are getting 30, 40%, 50% rent increases.
So I would say
it would prevent that.
Yes,
right?
it absolutely prevents that. So it prevents those kind of shock, absolutely displacing rent increases, and that's important. So I would say it's an anti-price gouging measure. Okay, but in terms of moving in, in terms of moving in, maybe with a family or whatever, and going, okay, I can, I like the school that I'm in the neighborhood of, and I can walk to work, whatever it is, I want to be here for a while. It does not in any way assure that, if your wages go up with inflation or whatever, that you will be able to stay in your housing. And that's the thing, rent control, rent stabilization it means stabilize rents. It means that your rent doesn't go up by more than you can afford to pay every year. And a 10% rent increase is not, yearly 10% rent increase is not what people can afford to pay.
So then the question of why statewide, some of the inside baseball on the politics that brought this proposal forward. When I'm reading, I've read a lot of Rachel Monahan's work from the Lamb Week on this, which has been good. She's saying there's not a lot of opposition from landlords at this point because they don't have the votes. Is this proposal something that they wanted to see or that they can swallow because it allows for a rent cap which is so high, it's not generally problematic, and it eliminates the local rent control sort of boogeyman that they would have to fight in Eugene and in Bend and in Salem and in Portland. So it's better to be like the devil I know, one of them, rather than a whack-a-mole landscape ahead of you as a landlord trying to fight all these little localized rent controls.
So I would say, I've got a lot to say about that. The landlords are the most freaked out about the just cause, the no more no cause stuff. The realtors are freaked out about the statewide rent control. And I even had a realtor reach out to me to try to kill the bill, which I did not respond to.
Oh, just like a personal phone call for you to like, oh, by the way, will you kill that bill?
Yeah, basically. He's like, I see you're unhappy with the bill. You kill it and he said, I'd rather have them lift the ban than statewide rent control because it does, it could potentially set, a big precedent. It's the state stepping in and saying, there's no reason that you need to raise the rent by 20, 30, 40, 50%, unless I guess the building is less than 15 years old, and then somehow you should be able to price it.
And we'll get into that a little bit. But if one state can do it, what's to stop other states from
exactly. And I think it is going to beg the question, all the normal like anti-rent control, rhetoric is that was, the Wall Street Journal was, coming with all the normal, but, the normal rent control bills limit rent increases to, like I said, 1, 2, 3, maybe 5%. So all the rhetoric coming in is not really fitting well because you have to ask why does anybody need to raise the rent by more than 10% a year? Like whose costs are going up that much? Nobody's wages are going up that much.
Right.
And so I do think it'll actually, I think for that reason it set an important precedent because it allows states to be like, well, because people, the landlords and the realtors can all be like, rent control doesn't work, it's so bad. And I'll say, well, do you think 100% rent increase is okay? Well, no, that's unreasonable. Well, 50%? Well, probably not. Well, where do you draw the line? Oh, we can't draw the line. That's rent control. So they start to see that as long as no rent control means we're allowing 30, 40, 50% rent increases, and that's economic violence as far as I'm concerned.
So they don't want to take money off the table that's potential coming into their pockets, obviously.
Right.
But do you feel like were there some compromises that were made on the landlord side? Were there an actual transactional thing that went down, which is like, we won't oppose this if you make sure it does this, this, and that?
Yeah. So Deborah Imsey from Multifamily Northwest said it perfectly in one of the Lamb Week stories where she basically said, after Monroe lost the election, so Senator Monroe was the Democratic senator holdout from 2 years ago when we tried to pass a similar
rent
bill.
Control and was primaried out
we primaried him out.
The activists and you in particular was involved in that.
And basically the landlords and the realtors lost all of their races, in the state. And she said, straight up to Rachel Monahan, it's not as easy as just saying no this year. Like they basically, there was a mandate. They knew it was happening. And so the subtext of her, it's not as easy as just saying no, means their tactic was to weaponize the bill. And so what they've done is saying, okay, A, we know this is happening. B, we still have power. And so, they still have a few senators or reps in their pocket or whatever, and have said, we know you have to vote for something. Here, we've written the bill that we would like you to pass. And that, and that is my biggest qualm with it, is that there weren't any renter advocates at the table for this bill. It was literally the chief sponsor is one of Rod Monroe's best friends who's at his fundraisers and stuff, and is a landlord herself, Senator Jenny Burdick, and so that's why we're not seeing the opposition from the landlords and realtors. It's not let's.
So you think they're basically like, this is what we can live with?
Not just what we can live with. I mean, there are parts of it that are literally designed to fail. I mean, it's gonna pass, and we're gonna have this false sense of protection, and then we're gonna see all the loopholes are like gaping holes in some cases, and people are gonna say, oh, rent control doesn't work.
Interesting.
Which is exactly what they do in they're like, rent control doesn't work, look at San Francisco. I'm like, well, why do you think it doesn't work in San Francisco? Like, look at those high rents. Well, rent control isn't that, they've illegalized vacancy control in the state of California. So when an apartment turns over, you can double the rent if you want. And that's a loophole, right? That's not rent control not working. That's, we broke rent control on purpose, and we are seeing what happens.
Right.
That,
Yeah. So let's talk about that though. So under this proposal, if a building becomes vacant, rents can reset. Is that
it doesn't have to be a building. If any unit becomes vacant voluntarily or through for-cause eviction, then they can reset rents. And that's a real big problem, because you could be economically evicted. You could have that 10% rent increase that you can't afford and move out. That's voluntary. And then they can raise the rent by another 10, 20, 50, whatever they want rent. Okay. And it's an eviction bonus. I mean, we love to talk about how hard and expensive and long the eviction process is. That's bullshit. Sorry.
It's the internet.
Okay. Eviction in the state of Oregon.
What can't you say at this point?
Right, exactly. In the state of Oregon, eviction is the fastest civil legal procedure behind getting a restraining order, and that's after you start the court process. You can give a for-cause eviction notice that doesn't need to be reported anywhere, and most tenants just move, or they cure it. But now a landlord is going to be incentivized to do that more, and to push people through the eviction court process, and to not be merciful in that regard, because they get to reset the rents if they force them out that way.
Now, another part of this is that rent control will only apply to buildings that are 15 years or older, and so in the discussions we have, I mean, the other side of that last argument is that if rents don't reset to market levels, then maintenance will be deferred. The buildings won't be profitable long term. Ownership will be, there'll be an incentive to let the buildings fall apart. Those are kind of the other sort of pushback argument. And I don't want to debate it.
I understand. That pushback is all based on first generation rent control, where New York City's very first rent control policy literally froze the rents. Those rents have not gone up since the 40s.
Right.
That's very different than and so, yeah, like those are arguments, but those are arguments that are not, they are provably false with contemporary rent control.
Yeah, and I think we haven't had a lot of test cases for contemporary rent control.
Well, we have. I mean, in California and New York and Canada and Washington, D.C., we just don't see them because there's a very well-funded, opposition to this that doesn't, that relies on misinformation and rhetoric and propaganda, and they don't want us to see those studies. There are studies that show that this deferred maintenance and lack of development, yada, yada, just doesn't happen.
So the other part of this is that buildings that are newer, 15 years or just built to 15 years, would not be beholden to this rent control or rent stabilization. And so you can see that as a good thing in many ways, in that a lot of the naturally occurring affordable housing is older stock housing, right? New housing, as we always say on this podcast, just in the free market will always go to the highest bidder, and that's how it gets financed. Otherwise, it wouldn't get built. And that working class folks, like the market doesn't build housing, brand new housing for working class folks, unless there's some kind of subsidy or regulation in place.
One of the people you interviewed for Priced Out, Elena, was in a building built in 2009, and she was forced out by a $400 rent increase, and that would not be prevented by this by this bill. So
Mhm.
you're right. I mean, that most buildings are for are higher end, but that's a new phenomenon. See, in 2009, when Elena's building was being built, we were still building like, kind of latchkey garden variety, prefab apartment, but whatever. Yeah, this whole new luxury trend is new. The the um, the justification behind a 15-year exemption, and that's pretty typical in most modern rent control policies. California actually just has exempted every building built after 1995 period. I think New Jersey has 30 years. I think in BC they roll it's 20 years. I'm not sure, but that makes sense when the rent caps are 1 or 2% or CPI or whatever they are. And that's why it's pretty typical, because you don't want it to disincentivize investment, because investors need to know that that they can kind of keep up with market rents. But I again, because the cap is so high, and I really think we need to talk about it as anti-price gouging, because the cap is so high, that's not going to disincentivize. You don't need to know that you can raise rents by more than 10% to build a new building. Banks, all the investors and banks that will finance these projects, they don't need or want to see anything more than 3 to 5%. I've talked, I've talked to some folks about this who've said, if you were projecting 10% yearly rent increases or even 7%, you wouldn't be taken seriously. You wouldn't get financing.
Right.
That's not a,
Right.
So we don't, I think, I can suggest multiple changes to this bill, but one is, how about we cap rent increases at the 7% plus CPI only for buildings 15 years and younger, and then 3 to 5% for everything else. There's just no reason to exempt them in that, because it's just the cap is so high. There's no reason. It's not going to disincentivize development, period.
Now, we've talked about Chloe Udali and her sort of rise into city council, and coming from the activist movement, and just recently, at least reported by Dilemma Week, she was saying on social media that she is also not happy with this proposal, and that
I haven't talked to anybody who's happy about it in that community. I mean, even though there are definitely organizations who've said step in the right direction, nobody's happy about it.
Can you tell us what she specifically is against?
Well, I'm not really at liberty to speak for her. I think she and I probably share a lot of the same concerns in terms of the cap being too high. I think the social media posts you're referring to, I think she's explicitly annoyed that the ban isn't going to be lifted, because that
the ban on rent,
the ban on
locally,
yeah, because really we just need more local tools. The legislature is poised to pass this bill very quickly. And while that's great on the one hand, part of the messaging behind that is we have these other bigger, more important things to do. This has been about a 4-year fight in the legislature on some level, and they keep saying that it's just a Portland problem, or
no, it's clearly not.
Well, it's clearly not. But
yeah,
I mean, they make these excuses to basically say like this is
like
we don't want to spend time on this. This is too messy, yada yada. And it's okay, fine. Then lift the ban. Let local jurisdictions deal with it, right? Pass this bill if you want. And again, let's call it anti-price gouging. Let's not call it rent stabilization. Pass the bill and then lift the ban and let us actually do rent stabilization.
So if you were talking to folks on the internet right now,
which I guess I am.
You are.
Hi, folks on the internet.
And they are behind you, they agree with your position, and what would you tell them to do here in these coming days? And because we're just days to weeks away from this getting a vote, right? What do you think they should do?
I would tell them to call their own senator and representative and demand, demand that we lift the ban, in addition to whatever else, at the very least. I would certainly demand that this bill be amended to actually protect tenants. So your own senator and representative are very important, regardless of their party or their championship of this bill or not. And then and by the way, local senator and representative, not your federal ones. And then other people who need to hear from you are Senator Jenny Burdick, Senator Peter Courtney, Senator Lee Beyer in Eugene. It's outrageous that he is not a champion of this with his constituency. Arnie Roblin on the coast, I'm hearing needs to be moved on this bill. So those are the four that come to mind to, and then Betsy Johnson, but I don't know, she is a landlord and seems to hate renters and believe that they should be used as ATMs. I'm not, I don't know if she can be moved, but
and go after her glasses. She's got weird glasses, right? So if you know someone who is in their district,
absolutely,
you could call them and say, hey, you should call. Let me tell you what's going on. Here's what I think, and here's the one way you could help us.
And you should, and then Senator Fagan is the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate. She is a very vocal champion for tenants and is disappointed in this bill. So she's having a hearing actually on Monday, February 4th at 3 p.m. So you can head on down to Salem to have your voice heard. And I would really encourage anybody and everybody to do that. And if you want to ride or want to coordinate your testimony, you can send a message to Portland Tenants United and we can help with that.
How do people get a hold of you?
So Facebook is one good way. Portland Tenants United on Facebook and messaging us. You can also email info@pdxtu. That's for Portland Tenants United.org. So info@pdxtu.org. And then you can also submit testimony by writing to Shamia's committee. I don't have the link, so we'll have to post some links. But I would definitely, you really want to make your voice heard at this time, especially right now, and take every opportunity to do that. And that, honestly, I think that's kind of the biggest issue with why this bill isn't the bill we deserve for all of our hard work and advocacy is that the landlords and realtors, they have time and they have money, and they use their money to compel, to persuade legislators. And they use their time to write letters and organize. And there just haven't been any calls to action this year to organize and to contact our legislators. And that's one of the things I heard from Alyssa Kinney Geyer when I met with her about this bill. She's just like, we just really haven't been hearing from renters, and that's
amazing. Well, I mean, that's what we always say in this podcast and at screenings. We say if you want to make a change or see a change in the political process, it doesn't stop. You have to vote, vote early, vote often. And once you do vote, then you have to hound your representatives. The reason why we get in some of these housing problems is because the activists go to sleep as soon as they win the election and somebody makes a promise. And it just doesn't work that way. You have to stay on your elected officials all the time if you want to see things happen. This is another object lesson in that. So thank you so much, Margot. It was wonderful having you on. Hope we can have you on again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And empower.
And you will hear from us again.